There are moments in life when everything looks fine on the outside, yet something quietly aches within. Moments when you measure your progress against others and feel late to your own life. Moments when comparison steals the peace you worked so hard to build. This is a story about purpose, not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that waits patiently to be noticed. A story about grace, earned not through speed, but through honesty. In a small, unremarkable town, there lived a man named Caleb Rowan. He wasn't broken, and he wasn't lost, but somewhere along the way, he began chasing someone else's timeline and forgot how to walk his own. Listen closely. You may recognize parts of yourself along his journey. Caleb Rowan woke each morning before the sun, not because he loved the early hours, but because discipline had become his proof of worth. The world was quiet then. No messages, no noise, no reminders of where others were in their lives. Just the soft hum of a kettle, the pale blue light creeping through the window, and the familiar weight in his chest. From the outside, his life looked steady. He had a job that paid the bills, a small apartment that stayed clean, a routine that rarely broke. People would have called him responsible, reliable, on track. But Caleb didn't measure life that way. He measured it in invisible comparisons. Who was ahead? Who had arrived? Who had already become something? Every scroll on his phone felt like a scoreboard. Someone announcing an engagement, someone celebrating a promotion, someone else finally finding their purpose. Caleb never envied their joy. What hurt was the quiet question that followed every update. Why not me? He wasn't lazy. In fact, he worked harder than most people he knew. He stayed late when others left early. He said no to distractions. He believed in effort, in patience, in discipline. Yet no matter how much he did, it never felt like enough, because someone else always seemed further along. In his mind, life had a timeline, and he was behind. At night he would sit on the edge of his bed and replay the years like missed turns on a map. The degree he chose instead of the one he wanted. The risk he didn't take. The moment he stayed quiet when he should have spoken. These weren't regrets exactly. They were measurements. Proof, he thought, of why others had moved faster. Caleb believed something deeply, even if he never said it out loud. That purpose was a race, and arriving late meant failing. So he pushed himself harder. More structure, more control, less rest. He believed that if he could just close the gap, work a little longer, sacrifice a little more, he would finally feel at peace. But peace never came. Because every time he reached a goal, his eyes shifted immediately to someone else's horizon. On his walk to work, he passed the same park each morning. Parents with strollers, runners moving with ease, an old man feeding birds on the same bench. Caleb watched them without judgment, but with a quiet confusion. They all seemed to be exactly where they were supposed to be. He wondered when that feeling would arrive for him. If you're honest, you may know this feeling too. The strange exhaustion of trying to live on time, someone else's time. The quiet pressure of believing that life is keeping score. Caleb didn't know it yet, but his struggle wasn't a lack of purpose. It was the belief that purpose could be compared at all, and that belief was about to be tested. Caleb decided that if life was a race, then he would run it without complaint. He began to wake even earlier. His mornings became sharper, tighter, more controlled. Cold showers, lists written the night before, goals broken into smaller goals, then smaller still. There was comfort in structure because structure didn't ask questions. It simply demanded obedience. He told himself this was what discipline looked like, and in many ways it was. Weeks turned into months, and something began to move. His work was noticed. A project he had quietly poured himself into was praised by people who rarely gave praise. His name came up in rooms he wasn't invited into. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make him feel briefly like his effort had weight. For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt hopeful. He walked with more purpose. His shoulders sat a little higher. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see failure, just someone in progress. He started believing that maybe all those years of restraint and patience were finally aligning into something meaningful. But even in these small victories, something remained unsettled. He noticed it during a lunch break, sitting alone with his coffee. A colleague across the table laughed as she talked about her next big step: moving cities, taking a risk. Finally going all in. People congratulated her, encouraged her, spoke about her courage. Caleb smiled. He meant it. Yet inside, the measuring returned. She's younger. She moved faster. She didn't wait as long. The climb was real, but so was the comparison. At night, he tracked his progress obsessively. Not just his own, but everyone else's. He didn't call it jealousy. He called it awareness. He told himself he was learning from others, studying the patterns of success. But the truth was simpler. He still believed that worth could be ranked. And so, discipline became something else. Not a tool for growth, but a weapon against inadequacy. He stopped celebrating small wins. They felt childish compared to the milestones others were reaching. He pushed through exhaustion, mistaking burnout for commitment. Rest began to feel like falling behind. The strange thing was, his life was improving. On paper, he was climbing. Yet the higher he went, the more anxious he felt, because the view only showed him how many people were still ahead. One evening, after a long day, Caleb sat alone at his desk long after everyone else had left. The building was silent, lights dimmed, screens glowing. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window and asked a question he had been avoiding. If I reach everything I'm chasing, will it finally be enough? He didn't have an answer, only the next task, the next goal, the next comparison. Caleb was climbing, but he was climbing someone else's mountain, and mountains have a way of revealing the cost of that mistake. The opportunity arrived quietly, almost modestly, after years of waiting. A position opened, one that matched the sacrifices, the long hours, the discipline. It was the kind of step Caleb had imagined would finally shift everything into place. The kind people describe as the moment things change. He didn't celebrate when he heard the news. He didn't tell anyone. He simply nodded, thanked the person who told him, and returned to his desk with controlled calm. Inside, though, something loosened. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a moving target. This was it, he thought. This is where I catch up. For weeks he prepared in silence. He refined his work, reread old notes, practiced conversations in his head late at night. He imagined how this step would finally validate his patience, how it would prove that his slower path had still been the right one. Then, without drama, it ended. A short meeting, polite words, a careful explanation that didn't quite explain anything. The decision had gone another way. Someone else had been chosen, someone with a different background, a different kind of confidence. a different story. Caleb listened. He nodded. He thanked them again. And then he walked out into the hallway where the air felt thinner than before. There was no anger at first, no explosion, just confusion. The kind that leaves you standing still long after everyone else has moved on. His mind replayed the conversation again and again, searching for a crack, some place where it could make sense. But there was none. That evening, the familiar weight returned, heavier this time. Not just disappointment, but something deeper. A quiet humiliation he couldn't name. It wasn't that he had failed, it was that he had believed this moment would save him. At home, he sat in the dark longer than usual. His phone buzzed with notifications he didn't open. Another announcement, another celebration, someone else arriving. The comparisons he had held at bay came rushing back with force. They're moving forward. I'm standing still. I waited too long. For the first time, Caleb questioned the story he had told himself about discipline, about patience, about timing. He wondered if his restraint had been wisdom or fear dressed up as virtue. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it did, it was shallow and restless. He dreamed of running towards something he could see clearly, only to find his feet sinking deeper with every step. In the days that followed, his routines continued, but without meaning. He woke early out of habit, not purpose. The lists still existed, but they felt hollow. Discipline without belief is just movement. Something inside him had cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that changes how you see yourself. Caleb had reached the point every climber eventually faces, the moment when effort no longer guarantees direction. And the collapse wasn't the loss of the opportunity. It was the loss of the story he had been living by. After the collapse, time stopped behaving the way it used to. Days still passed, but they felt indistinct, like pages in a book he wasn't really reading. Caleb moved through them quietly, automatically, carrying an invisible weight that no one else could see. To the world, nothing had changed. To him, everything had. The past began to speak louder than the present. He replayed old moments with cruel precision, not just the obvious ones, the missed opportunity, the failed step, but smaller choices he had barely noticed at the time. Conversations where he stayed silent, risks he postponed, paths he didn't take because they felt uncertain. He told himself he was reflecting, but it was punishment. Every memory became evidence in a case he was building against himself, proof that he had misunderstood life, that others had known something he didn't, that while he was being careful, the world was rewarding courage. Caleb started living in if only. If only I had moved sooner. If only I had been bolder. If only I hadn't waited for the right time. The future felt unreachable, so his mind anchored itself to yesterday. He avoided places that reminded him of who he used to be. The park, the cafe where he once planned goals with quiet optimism. Even certain songs felt dangerous. They carried versions of himself he no longer trusted. At night, guilt replaced rest. He lay awake thinking about timelines, ages, invisible deadlines. He calculated how far behind he might be, not just in career, but in life, in becoming someone. The worst part wasn't sadness, it was stagnation. Caleb wasn't moving forward, but he wasn't falling apart either. He existed in a narrow space between regret and fear, afraid to let go of the past because at least it was familiar, afraid to imagine a future that didn't resemble the one he had planned. So he clung to old versions of himself like anchors. The disciplined one, the patient one, the one who believed waiting would eventually be rewarded. Letting go of that identity felt like admitting it had all been a mistake, and that was unbearable. He told himself that holding on was strength, that revisiting the past meant learning from it, but deep down he knew the truth. He wasn't learning, he was hiding. The present asked something uncomfortable of him: acceptance, and acceptance felt too much like surrender. If you've ever felt trapped between who you were and who you hoped to become, you know this space. The heaviness of carrying an old story long after it stops serving you. The exhaustion of replaying chapters that can't be rewritten. Caleb didn't realize it yet, but his suffering wasn't caused by failure. It was caused by refusal. Refusal to release the past. Refusal to forgive himself. Refusal to step into a future that didn't promise comparison. The weight of yesterday was heavy, but it was also optional. And soon the weight would become too much to carry. Eventually, the noise inside Caleb grew so constant that he began to withdraw from everything that might disturb it. He stopped explaining himself to people, stopped sharing plans, stopped asking questions about the future. It was easier to stay quiet than to risk another reminder of where he believed he should be. His world grew smaller. Work became transactional. Conversations became polite and brief. Even his mornings, once structured with purpose, lost their meaning. He still woke early, but now he sat longer in silence, staring at the wall as if waiting for something to tell him what to do next. Nothing ever did. The apartment felt different in those days. Not lonely. Emptier than that, as if the rooms were holding their breath. The desk where he once mapped his ambitions now collected dust. The lists remained unfinished, not because he was tired, but because he no longer knew what they were for. This was the lowest point, not dramatic, not visible, just quiet erosion. Caleb wasn't sad in the way people recognize. He wasn't crying or breaking down. He was numb. And numbness has a way of convincing you that this is simply how life is now. He avoided mirrors when he could, not because he disliked what he saw, but because he didn't recognize it. The discipline was still there, but it felt mechanical, like a habit left behind after the belief had moved out. Some evenings he would sit on the floor with his back against the couch, lights off, phone face down. Hours passed without him noticing. Thoughts drifted in and out without direction. He wasn't thinking about solutions anymore. He was waiting, waiting for the ache to fade, waiting for clarity, waiting for himself to return. This is the place many people reach without realizing it. The space where effort has stopped, but healing hasn't begun. Where the past has lost its grip, but the future hasn't opened its door. Caleb believed he had reached the end of something. In truth, he was standing at the edge of change. But change doesn't announce itself with certainty. It arrives quietly, disguised as stillness, as exhaustion, as the realization that what you've been doing no longer works. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Caleb noticed something strange. He felt tired of carrying the weight. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. The thought surprised him. It wasn't despair, it was honesty. For the first time, he didn't want to fix anything, prove anything, chase anything. He simply wanted rest, and in that desire, small, fragile, unremarkable, was the first opening. The moment before movement becomes possible. The moment before the room, once empty, makes space for something new. Caleb didn't know it yet, but he was done resisting. And when resistance ends, change finally has permission to enter. The encounter didn't feel important at first. That's how most turning points arrive. One morning, unable to sit still in his apartment, Caleb wandered back to the park he had been avoiding. The air was cool, the ground still damp from the night's rain. He walked without direction, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered, as if hoping the world wouldn't ask anything of him. He noticed the old man on the bench before he realized why he had stopped. The man was the same one he had seen months ago, feeding birds with patient, deliberate movements. Nothing about him stood out. No wisdom in his posture, no dramatic presence, just calm, unrushed, as if time behaved differently around him. Caleb sat at the far end of the bench, leaving space between them. Silence settled naturally. The birds fluttered in and out, unafraid. After a while, the man spoke, not looking at Caleb, not interrupting anything. "You walk like you're late," he said gently. The words landed with unexpected weight. Caleb smiled politely, unsure how to respond. "I guess I am," he said. "Late to something." The man nodded, still watching the birds. "Most people are," he replied. "They just don't all admit it." They sat there longer, the silence no longer uncomfortable. Eventually, the old man turned slightly, as if remembering something. "You know," he said, "I spent half my life trying to catch up, and the other half learning there was nothing to catch." Caleb felt something shift, not sharply, but enough to notice. "What do you mean?" he asked. The man shrugged. "I mean, everyone's path looks fast when you're watching from the side, but you don't see the weight they carry. You only see the movement." Caleb stared ahead, the words echoing somewhere deeper than thought. The man continued, still calm, still unassuming. "You seem disciplined. That's rare. But discipline works best when it's rooted in care, not comparison." There was no advice, no instruction, just reflection, like looking into water and seeing yourself clearly for the first time. Before Caleb could respond, the man stood, brushing crumbs from his hands. "You're not behind," he said simply. "You're just early to understanding something others won't learn until much later." Then he walked away. No name exchanged, no closure offered. Caleb sat there long after, replaying the conversation. Not with urgency, but with curiosity. The words didn't demand belief. They invited consideration. For the first time in months, his thoughts weren't about what he had lost. They were about what he had misunderstood. If you've ever had a moment like this, a quiet sentence from a stranger, a line from a book, a passing thought that stays, you know how powerful it can be. Not because it fixes everything, but because it changes the question. Caleb had been asking, "Why am I behind?" Now another question appeared. What if I'm exactly where I need to be to learn this? And that question, gentle as it was, began to loosen the grip of comparison. Change did not arrive as motivation. It arrived as permission. Caleb didn't wake up the next day transformed. There was no surge of energy, no sudden clarity. Instead, there was a quiet decision to stop forcing himself forward before he understood where he was standing. He began with small things, not goals, not plans, just care. He slept a little longer when his body asked for it. He took walks without tracking steps or outcomes. He returned to his routines but loosened his grip on them, allowing space where pressure once lived. Discipline remained, but it softened. For the first time, Caleb practiced effort without urgency. He worked steadily, not to catch up, but to stay present. He focused on what was directly in front of him, resisting the urge to measure how it compared to someone else's progress. Some days, the old voice returned. You're slowing down. You're falling behind again. But now, he noticed it instead of obeying it. He didn't argue. He didn't suppress it. He let it pass like a thought that didn't require action. This was unfamiliar territory. Letting go didn't feel like strength at first. It felt like vulnerability, like standing without armor in a world that rewards speed and certainty. But beneath that discomfort, something else emerged. Relief. Caleb realized how heavy the constant measuring had been, how much energy it took to live as if life were a race with invisible judges. Without that weight, even ordinary moments felt different. He started enjoying his work again, not for what it promised, but for what it taught him. He read without thinking about how useful the knowledge might be. He exercised without imagining the future version of himself it might create. This wasn't resignation, it was alignment. Healing didn't come from doing less, it came from doing things for the right reason. Caleb began to understand something subtle but powerful. Purpose wasn't something waiting for him at the end of a path. It was something forming inside the way he walked. There were setbacks, days when comparison crept back in quietly, dressed as curiosity. He caught himself scrolling longer than he meant to, feeling the old tightness return. But now, he stopped sooner. He chose presence over proof, consistency over intensity, grace over self-criticism. If you're listening to this and feeling unsure about your own pace, this part matters. Growth doesn't always feel productive. Sometimes it feels like standing still while the world rushes past. But standing still, when chosen intentionally, is not stagnation. It's grounding. Caleb wasn't becoming someone new. He was returning to himself, stripped of timelines that didn't belong to him. And for the first time in a long while, his life didn't feel late. It felt honest. Peace, Caleb learned, is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of choice. Just when his days began to feel lighter, the old voice returned, not loudly, not dramatically, but with familiarity. It surfaced in moments of distraction, in passing comments, in updates he didn't mean to see, but saw anyway. Someone he once compared himself to announced a major milestone, the kind that once would have unraveled him. For a moment his chest tightened. The old measurement instinct stirred. See? They didn't slow down. You did. The thought arrived effortlessly, as if it had been waiting patiently. Caleb noticed how quickly the narrative tried to reclaim him, how convincing it sounded when framed as concern instead of fear. The voice didn't accuse, it questioned. Are you sure you're not settling? Are you sure this calm isn't just giving up? This was the new struggle. Not collapse, but temptation. The temptation to return to urgency, to trade peace for proof. He felt it most in the quiet hours, the times when no one was watching, when discipline was no longer enforced by anxiety, when the only thing guiding him was intention. And intention, unlike pressure, requires honesty. Some days Caleb slipped. He pushed himself too hard again, stayed late for the wrong reasons, compared outcomes instead of effort. He recognized the familiar exhaustion creeping back, but something was different now. He didn't spiral. Instead of shame, there was awareness. Instead of punishment, there was correction. He reminded himself why he had slowed down, not to avoid growth, but to reclaim it. He returned to the practices that grounded him: focused work, quiet reflection, movement without performance. Strength, he realized, wasn't proven by intensity. It was proven by consistency. Anyone can push for a short time out of fear. Few can move steadily without external validation. This time, when the old voice spoke, Caleb answered, not with resistance, but with clarity. I'm not behind, he thought. I'm becoming. That answer didn't silence the voice completely, but it weakened its authority. If you're on a similar path, understand this. Old habits don't disappear when you decide to change. They return to test whether your growth is real or reactive. Caleb passed the test not by being perfect, but by staying present. He learned to choose again, and again, and again. Each choice small, each choice quiet. But together they formed something stronger than comparison ever had. Trust. And trust, once built, doesn't rush. The shift was so subtle that Caleb almost missed it. One morning he realized he hadn't checked anyone else's progress in days. Not intentionally, not as an act of discipline. He simply hadn't felt the need. His attention had returned to something quiet, something closer, his own life. The days no longer felt like something to get through. They felt inhabitable. Mornings carried a calm rhythm. Work unfolded with steady focus. Even uncertainty felt less threatening because it was no longer being measured against someone else's certainty. Purpose, he discovered, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with milestones or applause. It revealed itself through alignment. The sense that your actions, values, and pace were finally in agreement. Caleb began to notice meaning in places he once overlooked. In finishing a task with care. In conversations that weren't about outcomes. In evenings that didn't require distraction. There was balance now. Not the kind that demands perfection, but the kind that adjusts naturally. When he worked fully. When he rested without guilt. He no longer borrowed anxiety from imagined futures. The world hadn't slowed down. He had. And in slowing, he had learned to see. He passed the park often and noticed the old bench, the one where something had shifted. The birds still gathered there. Different people came and went. Life continued, indifferent and generous at the same time. Caleb understood something then that had once felt impossible. Everyone is walking through a season you cannot see. Comparison only shows you the surface of their journey, never the weight beneath it. His own path, once a source of quiet shame, now felt personal, intentional, earned. There were still goals ahead, ambitions that mattered, but they no longer defined his worth. They were expressions of it. If you're listening and wondering when things will finally feel right, this part matters. Peace doesn't come when life becomes perfect. It comes when you stop arguing with the life you're in. Caleb hadn't arrived anywhere extraordinary, but he had arrived home, and that changed how everything else felt. There comes a moment in every journey when the story stops being about the character and starts being about you. Caleb's life did not transform because he moved faster. It transformed because he stopped measuring his worth against timelines that were never his to follow. If there is one truth his journey offers, it is this: comparison is not motivation, it is distraction. It pulls your attention away from the only path that can ever fulfill you. your own. Some lessons are learned through effort, others are learned through release. You don't fall behind in life because you're slow. You fall behind when you abandon yourself trying to keep up with others. Purpose cannot be borrowed. It cannot be rushed. And it cannot be proven through someone else's milestones. Discipline matters, but only when it's rooted in care, not fear. Strength matters, but only when it includes gentleness. Failure matters, but only if you let it teach instead of define you. Let go of the version of yourself that was trying to arrive on time. Hold on to the version of yourself that is learning to arrive honestly. Your journey will not look like anyone else's, and that is not a weakness. It is the point. There is healing in choosing your own pace. There is courage in refusing to measure your life by borrowed standards. There is peace waiting for you the moment you stop racing toward validation. If you feel late, pause. If you feel behind, breathe. If you feel lost, look inward, not outward. You are not failing. You are becoming. And becoming takes time. So walk your path with discipline, but also with grace, with effort, but also with forgiveness. Let your life unfold at the speed of truth, not comparison. If this story spoke to you, carry it with you. Share it with someone who needs permission to slow down. And if you want more stories like this, stories that remind you who you are beneath the noise, stay connected. Your path is not late. It is yours, and that has always been enough.